Our next speaker has 20 minutes. I checked in advance. Nick Bostrom is the director of Oxford's Future of Humanity Institute, which basically explores this whole range of different issues. He approaches it from a background in probability theory. He's written a book titled The Anthropic Bias, which basically talks about how selection effects that people have get shaped by the experiences that we've seen, and how that may distort what we think a biased or unbiased inquiry is like. And so presents sort of a little bit more of a mathematical and philosophical perspective on some of these debates. And with that, let me give the floor over to Professor Bostrom. And I'll give you a 3-minute warning. Okay. So, great.
Okay. Well, so the title of my talk is Existential Risks and Artificial Intelligence. It will be mainly on existential risks, which I figure will be my sort of distinctive perspective on today's issue. I have quite a few slides here, so let's just get racing through them. We can characterize a risk in terms of 3 dimensions: scope, which would be the number of people affected; intensity, how badly affected each affected person would be; and the probability, its subjective probability of occurring given available information. So if we plot this in a diagram, plot scope on one axis here, distinguish a few qualitative categories of different scope that the risk can have, and intensity at the other. We can fill it in with a number of familiar types of phenomena. So your car is stolen, for instance, would be an endurable personal risk. It affects one person, It's more than imperceptible, but you can get through it. You can still have a good life even after your car has been stolen. You can recover from it. A terminal risk in this nomenclature would be one that would either be fatal, it could kill you, or it could permanently destroy your life in some other way, say permanent brain damage or lifetime imprisonment or something like that. It really dramatically and seriously curtails your potential for achieving a good life. So we fill in some more here. Generally, as we move upwards and to the right in this diagram, we get more serious risks that have larger scope and higher intensity. So if we take an imperceptible transgenerational risk, say the loss of one species of beetle, nobody would really notice, but it would be more than global in the sense it would not only affect the current state of the world, but it would be a permanent loss. The thinning of the ozone layer might be an endurable global risk. What can we put here in the terminal global category? Maybe aging. It will kill us all if we don't solve it, so it's a terminal risk. It's not a transgenerational one in the sense that even if we fail to solve it now, there is still a chance that it could be fixed later. So that leaves one thing up here in the right corner. So this cluster of 4 boxes there we can call global catastrophic risks. So these are really big risks. What I put in the boxes here is just for illustration, so it's not necessarily the biggest or most representative examples of each kind. So that leaves us with this top box here, which I call existential risks. So these are transgenerational terminal risks. That means it's impossible to recover from them, and they will affect not just everybody alive today, but the whole future of humanity. So this is the definition. An adverse outcome would either annihilate Earth-originating intelligent life or permanently and drastically curtail its potential. We have a lot of experience with other kinds of risks and dangerous animals of different sorts, hostile tribes and individuals, foods and berries and mushrooms that can be toxic, automobile accidents, Chernobyl, Bhopal, volcano eruptions, earthquakes, droughts, tsunamis, wars, epidemics of different diseases, influenza, smallpox, black plague, AIDS. Those kinds of disasters have occurred many, many times throughout human history. And our attitudes towards risk have been shaped by trial and error in dealing with those types of risks. But even the worst of these catastrophes, as tragic as they might have been for the people immediately affected, and there might have been millions affected in some of these examples, if you zoom out and look at this from the point of view of humanity as a whole, if there is such a point of view, even the worst of these disasters would be mere ripples on the great sea of life. They haven't significantly affected the total amount of happiness or suffering there will have been. They haven't determined or significantly shaped the future of humanity. Global catastrophic risks are a different kettle of fish altogether. Here are some recent opinions that suggest that some people, at least, believe that existential risk is worth taking seriously. Sir Martin Rees might be the most well-known of the recent people to have written about this in his book, which was called in England Our Final Century, but adapted for a US audience with its... at least the publishers thought it had a shorter attention span, so here it was called Our Final Hour. But he put the figure to 50%. Professor John Leslie, a philosopher, wrote a book a few years back in the late 90s, where he came up with a figure of 30% for the next 500 years. Sir Martin Rees's figure was for the next 100 years. Judge Richard Posner, one of the preeminent legal scholars of this country, wrote a book on this a couple of years ago where he doesn't give a number, but he says that there is a significant risk. He clearly thinks it's serious and very well worth worrying about. I wrote a paper, this was a few years ago, said 25%. All of these numbers are really grabbed from a hat to some extent. They are very subjective. Nevertheless, these are pretty much the only 4 books that have been written on this topic in the last decade, and they all concur that the risk is, well, according to these numbers, it's alarmingly high. Now, there might be a publication bias here, and presumably if you believe that the risk is greater, you are more likely to write and publish books about it. But nevertheless, there is a consensus among all those who have studied it that the risk is very high. Other people as well have been concerned in various ways and in different degrees. Bill Joy, of course. Some of the people on the panel here have also been concerned with this. Before we go on, I'll return to this a little bit towards the end of my talk. Now, even if the risk was much smaller than this, suppose it was not 50% or 20%, but even just 2% or 1%, that might seem very little, but in view of the enormous consequences, it would still be very worth being concerned about. Okay, there are different ways you can carve up existential risks in different categories. So one distinction one can make is anthropogenic risks vis-a-vis non-anthropogenic ones. So anthropogenic ones would be ones that result in some way from human civilization or human activity. I believe that the real issue is the anthropogenic risks. Without going into details, there is a simple way of making this at least prima facie plausible, which is that our species has survived the non-anthropogenic risks for tens of thousands, well, hundreds of thousands of years. They haven't wiped out the human species yet, so this includes things like meteors and earthquakes and other things. So if they haven't managed to do this in the last 100,000 years, then it's probably not going to happen in the next 100 years, say. The non-anthropogenic risks, on the other hand, resulting from human activity, might very well pose a much greater threat over the next 100 years, because we are now doing a lot of things that we have never done before, and we will be doing a lot more of those things in this coming century, including particularly new technologies. So this is what I think should be the primary focus of efforts to reduce existential risks. Now, there is good news and bad news in this. On the one hand, anthropogenic risks, since they arise from human activity, they are also, without exception, in principle, within our power and ability to do something about. On the other hand, it's often extremely complex and difficult to change these risks that emerge from our human behavior. Okay, let me, so here's another way you can divide different types of existential risks. Bangs, Earth-originating intelligent life goes extinct in a relatively sudden disaster. So this is perhaps what comes most immediately to mind when one thinks of extinction scenarios. It's not the only type of existential risk. So part of using this terminology here is that it draws attention to the other, more perhaps subtle ways in which we could suffer an existential disaster. Crunches. Humanity's potential to develop into post-humanity is permanently lost, although human life continues in some form. So here it's just useful to have a term for the potential state of flourishing that human civilization might one day be able to attain if everything goes well. So I use the term post-humanity for this, just to have a label for it. Shrieks. A limited form of post-humanity is durably attained, but it is an extremely narrow band of what is possible and desirable. And whimpers, finally, post-human civilization is temporarily attained, but then it evolves in a direction which leads gradually to either the complete disappearance of things we value or to a state where these things are realized only to a minuscule degree of what could have been achieved. Now I will breeze through in the next 4 slides a couple of examples of each of these different categories. The bangs. So here we have nanotechnological weapons systems used either deliberately to destroy the world or maybe in some accident scenario or an arms race where an accident becomes more and more likely. Or, 2, badly programmed superintelligence. And again, there are different scenarios of this. I think some of the other speakers will talk more about it. If you have a very rapid takeoff singularity scenario, then it might be easier to see that this could happen, but even within a softer takeoff, this would be a threat. We're living in a computer simulation and it gets shut down. I will not talk about that here, but there is a paper here that you can look if you're interested in that. It might seem weird to throw in all these so this is almost, a bizarre or philosophical or science fiction risk compared to some of the others, like nuclear holocaust, which is very concrete. So maybe I should say that the criterion for listing something here, well, first of all, it's to some extent arbitrary. I wanted some examples. But second, it's not necessarily the greatest risks right now. So, for example, nanotechnological weapon systems can't kill us now because we don't have any nanotechnological weapon systems. But if something is going to cause an existential disaster ever, we're looking back, what was the most likely way for that to have happened? Then things like superintelligence and nanotechnological weapon systems, in my view, would rank high up that list, at least in the banks category. Okay, nuclear holocaust, so probably not going to happen with the arsenals we have today, but again, there can be future nuclear arms races in the future, which could build up much larger arsenals than during the Cold War. Biological weapons, nanotechnology, non-weapons accident. So this illustrates again that exactly where a risk will appear on this list depends on how finely you split it up. You can sort of make a risk more probable by just lumping more together in it by definition. So it's useful, I think, to split the weapons systems from the non-weapons accident risk part, because they raise quite different issues. But, natural pandemic, runaway global warming, supervolcano eruptions, physics disasters. I recently published a paper on that in Nature together with Max Tegmark, where we managed to place a very reassuring upper bound on that particular risk. Impact hazards from asteroids and comets. That's one of the risks which is real, but small and knowably small. It's one of the things we can actually rigorously calculate. And space radiation is lumped together different kinds of radiation hazards from space, from gamma ray bursts and other things like that. Crunches. ranging from resource depletion or ecological destruction, misguided world government, or another static social equilibrium that stops technological progress. So again, in judging the plausibility of something like that, don't think of whether right now, at this moment, or in the last few years, the world has happened to be moving more towards global governance or further away from it, but think from a much bigger time perspective, whether something like this could happen. And it might seem that if we think we started out by being hunter-gatherer tribes and then cities and city-states and nation-states and now regional forms of governance in different parts of the world, might not be such a far-fetched idea. And again, listing that risk here doesn't mean that one should either be in favor or opposed to international forms of governance. A lot of the things that are listed here could have beneficial effects, could actually help reduce risks overall, but might still also pose risks in their own right. Dysgenic pressures, so these would be evolutionary selection that could kick into effect at various points in our future and lead in the wrong direction. It's not true that evolution by some natural law must always lead to better, more valuable, higher complexity. It can also evolve things. 5 minutes. In the other direction, technological arrest was just maybe turns out that there is a complexity threshold. Social collapse, shrieks. So these would be things that realize just a very narrow slice of post-humanity. So maybe some kind of flawed superintelligence that that still preserves some useful, valuable, intelligent life in the universe, but it could have been much more and better. Repressive totalitarian global regime and takeover by a transcending upload. So this is, again, a particular scenario where a superintelligence would arise out of a particular human brain being uploaded and then enhanced iteratively. So that, would preserve one little element of humanity, perhaps, but it should have been all of us rather than just one. And finally, whimpers. Our potential or even core values are eroded by evolutionary development or self-modification. So this one aspect of this threat is that we gain increasing abilities to modify ourselves with technology, and if we use that imprudently or unwisely, we might end up going down a path where if we had seen the destination in advance, we would never have wanted to go there, totally dehumanized, whereas each little step on its own might seem attractive. Killed by an extraterrestrial civilization, again, not an imminent threat, I think, but if you look at the good case scenario where we survive and spread through the galaxy, then, who knows, a billion years from now, this might be one of the things that keep people awake at night. So in the last little part of my talk, let me just mention some of the challenges that confront us here. One issue, mainly, are the cognitive difficulty of thinking about existential risks in a rational way. It's very difficult for people, it appears. The tendency, rather, is either to ignore existential risks altogether, or to be alarmist about them, or to use them as inspiration for selling science fiction or doing science fiction movies or something like that. It's very difficult for people to sort of address them, at least with the same rationality as you would apply if you were buying a car, say. And this is reflected as well in the point that I made earlier, that 4 books, popular books, by the way, it's not serious scientific philosophical treatise, but 4 books written for the general audience. That's the sum total of effort that humanity has managed to devote to thinking about its own survival. Pretty much. I'm exaggerating slightly, but not as much as one would like to think. So more specifically, there are various biases that infect human cognition that seem to have broad applicability, but one has reason to think that they would be more severe when it comes to thinking rationally about existential risks than in other fields. Let me just pick out one here, which is the scope neglect. So here, one experiment was various people were asked about how much would they be willing to pay to save either 2,000 birds, 20,000 birds, or 200,000 birds from dying in uncovered oil ponds. And the result was to save 2,000 birds, on average, people would pay $80. To save 20,000 birds, $78. And 200,000 birds, $88. Not a statistically significant difference. And I mean, looking at this result and then comparing that to the complete neglect of existential risks, it's compared to how much effort is devoted to reducing much smaller hazards. It's difficult not to think that there is an analogy there. And this type of finding is also something that philanthropists in attendance here today would do well to keep in mind day and night. So I will now go through very briefly, finally, why this is...
1 minute left.
1 minute? Okay. Very briefly. Well, in fact, I won't. Let me just skip to the conclusion page. Basically, what the thing I'm skipping here is saying is just that reducing existential risks, even by the tiniest amount, is still worth a lot. It's basically, the conclusion is that it's worth more reducing existential risk by the tiniest amount than pretty much anything, well, than anything else that you could possibly do. If you calculate the numbers and make some possible assumptions, that's the seemingly inevitable conclusion, at least if you have some kind of utilitarian perspective. So, just to finish up here, what should be done? Well, the primary finding is that we don't really know what should be done, and it's not easy to figure out what should be done. It's very complex. It's easy to come up with some idea that one thinks one should change the world in this way or the other, and that will reduce existential risk. But sometimes what seems like a good idea will actually increase existential risk. So in light of this ignorance, it might be a good idea to do more thinking and research on the methodology of existential risk studies, more research into specific risk categories, like risk from nanotech, risk from AI, etc. To build institutions, sciencey and policy communities of scholars and policymakers that are concerned with existential risks. Specific efforts to reduce specific threats, like pandemic disease surveillance networks, can be done and exist in some form, can be expanded. Near-Earth object surveillance, this is also being done to some extent to map out asteroids and meteors. Nanotech safety and design ahead efforts, perhaps. Friendly AI research, perhaps. I don't have time to discuss these, but at least these are points here. I'm not saying these are the best possible things we should do, but at least there were things that spring to mind as possible things we should consider if we're concerned with existential risks. More general things like peace, cooperation and frameworks for international coordination are probably good. We don't know. Possibly differential technological development. If we could figure out which technologies would make things safer if they happened before others, that could also be a major thing. And I think I have not gone too much over time. I'm finished now. Yep. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, thank you very much.